Thank you, Byron and Garance. One thing I wanted to mention that I felt I learned from this project, uh, one of the most exhausting pieces of the process was, of course, dealing with what dozens of very rich and very powerful tech companies who tried to intimidate us in all sorts of ways. I mean, I remember a memorable call Dake and I had, with the vice president. They really pushed hard. So one thing I learned from this process, normally calling the companies and asking for a response is one of the last things we do. So, because we don't want them to get ahead of us, et cetera, et cetera. But this project made me wonder if it might be worthwhile to do it earlier in the process. The companies were actually very useful in passing on dirt about other companies. As in, they would say, oh, we definitely don't do that, but you really should check out so and so and what they did on so and so at this time and at this place. And we were like, okay, okay, we will. And we did. So that was one thing I learned that sort of made me think about our timing a little bit. And then before we open to questions, I just wanted to give a shout out to, I mean, this was, as Byron said, very much a team effort involving people across the AP. I also wanted to give a shout out in particular to our great visual team. And that would be David Goldman, Marshall Ritzel, Serginho Roosblad, Felipe Dana. Garant, would you give us just a 2-minute summary of what they did and how it added to the project?
Absolutely. So I think with this particular project, we were all thinking, how can we visualize these surveillance technologies that are really meant to go unseen? How can we help the public understand not only who they're impacting, but what they look like? And so our colleague Felipe Dana had this brilliant idea to kit out a Sony camera to recognize infrared beams of light. So those are the beams of light that, say, your iPhone emits for facial recognition purposes, to measure the quadrants of your cheeks, etc., as well as the lights that automated license plate reader systems emit when trying to capture the numbers and letters on your license plates. And so then he and David Goldman and other colleagues in China actually used this camera to capture these actually beautiful images of the infrared light that really brought forward much more of a sense as to how these technologies work and impact our daily lives and most intimate details, our facial features. And then, as I mentioned earlier, our colleague Ross Franklin drove all around Arizona to get otherwise pretty boring photos of hidden automated license plate readers, but he made them really just fun, if that's possible, right? He took pictures of orange traffic cones where there's a secret camera hiding inside, and so I think that that really brought home to our audiences that these technologies are not rocket science, that it's actually something that you yourself can understand. And then finally, our colleague Marshall Ritzel on the illustrations team just did a beautiful visual presentation on some raw video footage and used an object classifier to help the public understand on a YouTube video, how these systems sort what's a truck, what's a train, etc. So I think we really all benefited so much from that creativity.
Mary, I think you're muted.
That was embarrassing. I'm sorry, everyone. I am no longer muted. I was going to say, let's move on to questions. And please, everyone, put your questions in, and the reporters will be happy to try and answer them. Let's start with this first question. When reporting information from an important but confidential source, how do you present the facts clearly while protecting the source's identity? Why don't I throw that one to Dake and Byron because I think you guys would deal with it, in different ways. Dake, you're up first.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the ways in which we do this especially it's really more an art than a science. It's often case by case. Various sources have various degrees of comfort. Also, depending on their personal situation, are they inside the country? Are they outside the country? How much of a threat would it be if their identity was exposed, so on and so forth. But a couple concrete ways of dealing with that is one, you can interview a bunch of people. And then you can summarize what, say if you interviewed 15, former officials and engineers who worked on Xinjiang's, back-end surveillance system. You can put in, generally speaking, what they have told you, um, in a few graphs, and there's just no way they're going to be able to figure out who told you these things, right? Because it's all kind of mixed up in all of those different interviews together. So I think that's one of the easiest ways of dealing with that kind of situation. In other cases, it's kind of like a scale, right? How much detail you want to provide, and what kind of, balanced with the kind of information you're trying to provide. Obviously, things identifying places like names, but then also gender, location, job title, stuff like that, all considerations, right? I mean, if you say that this is a, ethnic Kazakh who is from this particular city doing this kind of job, but you don't mention their name, obviously that could give away something. If you say it's just someone who was familiar with the back end of this operation, it's much harder to figure out who that person is, right? But I know there's with anonymity, we generally try to avoid it and have some named sources, and we generally build the stories around our named sources. They're just much better as characters as well, because if you can see their face, if you can see their name, you get much more of a sense of who they are as a person, as a reader, and it's much more compelling. But yeah, I mean, sometimes that is kind of unavoidable. So I would say those are the two ways I can think of off the top of my head.
Byron, do you want to throw in anything on this point?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we took a similar approach when we were reporting on this stuff in the United States. There are similar dynamics. Luckily for this particular series, nothing we were writing about was classified, so nobody was going to prison for speaking to us, but there are still reputational risks. In many instances, we were talking to law enforcement officials, and there is that sort of thin blue line that police officers don't like to necessarily speak out about what other departments are doing because they feel like, they're acting in the name of public safety. So unfortunately, we did have to use a lot of anonymous sources, and the way we dealt with trying to protect identities was similar. We talked to a lot of people, first of all. Second of all, a lot of what they told us was actually backed up in documents, and so that was quite helpful. And often vice versa. Sometimes the documents led us to sources who could illustrate and confirm what was happening in the documents and add more meat to the bone. And so, for this particular project, while we still had serious source protection concerns, it's sort of lesser than um, other sort of national security stories. And I will add on to what Dake was talking about source protection. Like this stuff does come up also in the United States. Like again, we we're not talking about people who will be jailed for talking to us, but we certainly don't ever want to expose our sources. So I think when Grants and I both took trips during the reporting of this, we were very conscious about not writing people's names down in computer systems. I literally used a burner cell phone to cross international borders, going on vacation to Iceland because I didn't want to carry anything with my journalistic notes across the border and subject it to search by DHS while actively reporting a critical story on DHS. And I think Garance had the same experience at some point, or maybe it makes that a routine practice. So these kind of source protection concerns, while not as dramatic as in China, definitely exist here in the United States.
So let me throw the next question from Bill Holstein. Bill says, and let me throw this one to you, girls. Have any of you looked at the TikTok deal? The big tech boys, Allison, for example, secured 80% control of TikTok USA, but ByteDance seems to be still managing the algorithms and recommendation engines, could still have access to the data stored on Oracle servers. Any insights? Garance, this one's yours.
Thanks so much for the question. I mean, I think we all were very interested in that deal, and touched on it a bit in some of the reporting looking at the relationship between the US government and the Chinese government and how the US government has really sold uh, a whole variety of different technologies, aided in the sale of those technologies to governments over time. And I think that with ByteDance, the particular thing that we were looking at is, it comes in this moment where Trump and Xi have had two very important meetings, both this year and last. And I think these issues are only going to continue to evolve in new and interesting ways, especially as tech companies become so central to this administration. And so I'd say it's one that we're keeping an eye on, but like every deal, it has its nuances.
Thanks, girls. Next question from Amrad. You clearly had to balance sourcing and data and risk in a story of this scale. What were the hardest judgment calls along the way? So I will throw that open to everyone, but I actually wanted to talk about one aspect of this. I think one of the things that honestly was scariest about this project is, again, we were facing dozens of companies who frankly have a lot more money and a lot more lawyers than the AP does. So that meant, among other things, that we went through a very rigorous legal process. And very rigorous legal process. And I think it would be safe to say that most of us face a much more difficult environment today than we did, say, 3 or 4 years ago in that respect. In that, everything we publish now has that much more risk. And, obviously we went ahead with the series anyway, but a lot of vetting went into it. Um, Other Dake, anything you would like to jump into in terms of judgment calls? One thing that might be interesting is the Young family. They were already being scrutinized by police, and we brought a whole lot more attention to them. And obviously, you and I talked about concerns of, was that going to be a problem?
Right. Yeah, I was going to say one of the hardest judgment calls was actually part editorial, part sourcing, which was who was going to be the main character of the first story. We went, and that was partially an editorial decision. I think initially we had some earlier drafts that maybe centered Xinjiang at the very top, but it was felt as though that was too possibly too dated. I mean, some of those anecdotes were, dating
Yeah.
back 7, 8 years ago. And we really wanted something where it brought people into the now. This is happening immediately. But then you encounter this thorny issue of, okay, but if you're talking about something that's happening now, and you have to have a person who's named and willing to expose their identity, and it's happening in China, then you get to the risky part, right? And the thing is, in China, I think this is the thing with sourcing in China is most people that you talk to do not want to take risks. They are conditioned to avoid talking about anything political because there is a very well-oiled machine that will possibly get you into, a kind of sliding scale of trouble depending on how much you push various narratives or, stories that might cut against the party line. But there are a group of people that they really want their story out there, pretty much no matter. And that there is also a scale there. I mean, there are some people, I think I mentioned earlier, journalists anonymously and leak information. And there are also, but they don't want to go public with their identity. And then there's people who are basically willing to tell everything. They've accepted that this is the price that they're going to pay, and they know what the risks are. And I think when we're selecting people who we feature in our stories, we really want to make sure that they are fully well informed of what they're getting themselves into, right? So with the Youngs, I mean, this was a family that was publicly advocating for their own case for years. The daughter is living overseas in Japan, and she was operating a Twitter account that was not very well noticed. And she was really actively trying to get more attention to the plight of her family. And so, in her particular case, I mean, I went and I met her in person, and I talked to her, and I told her very directly, I mean, I don't know if you've been featured in foreign media reporting before, but this attention may not necessarily uh, make the government more favorable to your family. It could actually backfire in some ways. But she was very, very clear that she very much wanted that attention nonetheless, and that's what made us comfortable with moving forward with featuring that family.